Welcome back to the second session of Discourse and Power, and we stopped on the slide talking about discourse reproduces inequality. Dominant groups maintain their positive and the positions through discourse practices that neutralize hierarchies and marginalize alternative perspectives. Naturalize, the key term here, naturalization means making social constructions appear natural, inevitable, just the way things are rather than products of human choice that could be otherwise. For example, capitalism isn't natural, it's a historically specific economic system that humans created and could change, but specialists discourse centralize it, that just how the economy works, supply and demand is natural law, free markets are inevitable, this naturalization protects capitalism from fundamental questions. Dominant groups, those with more wealth, more institutional power, more social privilege, benefit from existing arrangements and use discourse to maintain them. They do not necessarily do this consciously or maliciously. Often they genuinely believe their position is natural, earned, deserved, but this course analysis reveals how their advantage is reproduced through language praxis. Marginalize alternative perspectives, discourse that challenges dominant views gets marginalized, dismissed as radical, unrealistic, impractical, biased, or simply ignored. Marginalized doesn't require banning alternative discourse, though that happens too. It works by positioning alternatives and extreme, unusual, not serious, thereby protecting the center. Third principle, ideology shapes language. Underlying belief systems and worldviews are embedded in seemingly neutral language choices, making ideological assumptions appear as common sense. Ideology means systems of beliefs about how the world is and should be organized. Everyone has ideology, it's not something only other people have while you're neutral. Your ideology shapes how you see reality, what seems obvious or strange, what seems natural or constructed. Crucially, ideology operates most powerfully when invisible, when it seems like common sense rather than ideology. When assumptions appear so obvious, they don't need arguing that ideology successfully naturalized. Language embeds ideology, word choices, grammatical structures, metaphor framing, all carry ideological weight even when appearing natural or neutral. CDA's task is making visible the ideological work language performs, showing that what appear natural or neutral is actually constructing particular worldviews and serving particular interests. Tools of CDA Analyze Part 1. Now let me give you the concrete analytical tools CDA uses. These are specific linguistic features to examine when analyzing discourse, grammar, and syntax. Analyzing active versus passive voice, transitive versus intransitive verbs to identify agency and responsibility. Active voice, police killed the suspect. Think about police, the agent, the one acting responsible. Passive voice, the suspect was killed. This removes the agent hiding who did the killing. Or passive voice with vague agent The suspect was killed by gunfire. Gunfire doesn't shoot itself, someone fired it, but passive construction obscures this. CDA examines when passive voice gets used and why. Often passive voice protects powerful actors from accountability, while active voice emphasizes agency of less powerful. The student failed the class, students responsible versus the students was failed by education system responsible frame failure very differently. Word choice and lexicalization, examining the loaded terms, euphemisms, and semantic associations. uh, every lexical choice carries connotations and positions subjects in particular ways. Consider terms for people crossing borders without authorization, illegal aliens, undocumented workers, unauthorized immigrants, refugees, migrants. Each term frame these people differently, activates different associations, implies different moral evaluations and policy responses. Use euphemisms euphemisms disguise unpleasant realities, collateral damage instead of civilian death, enhanced integration instead of torture, right sizing instead of layoffs. CDA asks who benefits from these euphemisms, what realities do they obscure? Topic control. Identifying who introduces, maintains, or shifts conversational topics. Control over topics is measured from form of power and discourse. In conversations, whoever controls what gets discussed shapes the entire interaction. Teachers control classroom topics, doctors control medical consultation topics, interviewers control job interview topics, news editors control what topics get covered, politicians try to control debate topics, CDA examines who introduces topics, whose topics get pursued versus dismissed, who can shift topics versus who must follow. This reveals power asymmetries. Turn thought patterns. Observing interruptions, overlaps, and speaking time distribution. Who can interrupt whom? Who speaks for how long? Who must wait politely versus who can jump in? These patterns reveal status and power. Higher status is speaking interrupt more and are interrupted less. They take longer term, they control when conversations end. Research shows, for example, that men interrupt women more than women interrupt men, that white people interrupt people of color more. Thus, professors interrupt students more than students interrupt professors. These patterns reproduce social hierarchies through everyday interaction. Uh, Rhetorical devices. Detecting metaphors, repetition, contrast, and other persuasive techniques. Metaphors frame understanding by describing one time in one thing in terms of another. Argument is war. We talk about attacking positions, defending claims, winning or losing arguments. This metaphor make arguments seem competitive rather than cooperative, zero sum rather than mutually beneficial. Alternative metaphors. Argument is journey, or argument is building word constructs very different understandings. Repetition emphasizes and reinforces. Politicians repeat slogans and talking points to make them stick. Contrast sets up binary oppositions, us versus them, good versus evil, modern versus backward. These rhetorical devices shape understanding powerfully. Presupposition and implicature, uncovering assumed or implied meanings not explicitly stated. Pre-assumptions are assumptions built into language. When did you stop beating your life? Pre-purposes, you were beating your life. Why is the economy improving? Purposes, the economy is improving. These presuppositions smuggle in claims without arguing for them, making them harder to challenge. Implicature is implied meaning. What suggested without being said explicitly. Some politicians are honest, implicates that some aren't. Here is smart for a jock, implicates jocks typically aren't smart. CDA examines these implicit meanings that shape understanding while remaining deniable. Intertextuality traces how text references, quotes, or response to other texts. No text exists in isolation. Texts reference earlier texts, responding to ongoing conversations, cite authorities, parody opponents. Intertextuality creates webs of meaning across discourses. CDA traces these connections to understand how meaning accumulates, how authority gets established, how debate develop modality, examining expressions of certainty, obligations, or possibility. Must, should, might, could, will, may. These model expressions reveal speaker's stance and authority. The defendant must pay restitution, strong obligation, versus the defendant should pay restitution, weaker, versus the defendant could pay restitution, possibility, restitution, which means compensation, تعويض. Who can use strong modality versus who must use hedged, uncertain language reveals power. These tools provide concrete methods for analyzing discourse. You do not just have vague impressions. You can point to specific linguistic features and explain their social functions. Now let's go to case study media representation of marginalized groups. Let me give you a concrete case study showing CDA in action media representation of refugees. Consider how mainstream media often portrays refugees. Headlines might use verbs like flood, swarm, or invade when describing refugee movements, language that frame vulnerable people as threatening forces or nature or military threats. Passive constructions like refugees were detained hide the agents, immigration officials, government policies responsible for detention. Meanwhile, refugees themselves are rarely quoted for giving voice in stories by their own expressions. This discourse pattern reproduces power imbalances by denying agency to marginalized groups while naturalizing restrictive policies as nearly responses to crisis. CDA helps us recognize and challenge these patterns. Power dynamics in everyday interactions introduction. Now, let me shift from analyzing media and public discourse to examining power in everyday interactions, the conversations you have daily. Power does not operate in grand political speeches or media texts. It permeates our most mundane everyday interactions. The conversations we have with doctors, teachers, bosses, and even friends contain subtle power dynamics that shape outcomes and relationships. This is crucial to understand. The power isn't just dramatic, it's just or it's just in obviously politically contexts. It's operating when you walk to your doctor about symptoms, when you ask your professor about an assignment, when your boss gives you feedback, when you negotiate with roommates about household chores, when you text your parents. Every interaction involves power dynamics, though often so subtle and naturalized we do not notice them. Recognized or recognizing these patterns helps us navigate social situations more effectively and challenge inequitable power distributions. When you uh, understand how power operates in everyday talk, you can respond more strategically, can advocate for yourself more effectively, can create more equitable interactions. Let me give you specific examples showing power dynamics in familiar interaction types. Doctor-patient conversations. Medical consultations exemplify power asymmetry. Doctors typically control topics, ask questions, while patients answer, use specialized terminology that creates distance and make unliteral decisions. Studies show doctors interrupt patients within 18 seconds of them beginning to describe their concern. This power dynamic can lead to misdiagnoses when patients' lived experiences are dismissed in favor of medical expertise. However, informed patients increasingly negotiate this relationship by preparing questions, requires or requesting explanations, and participating in treatment decisions. Additional student discussions, classroom discourse often follows the IRE, invitation, response, evaluation pattern. Teachers ask questions, students respond. Teachers evaluate answers. This structure positions teachers as knowledge gatekeepers and students as passive recipients. While appropriate for some learning goals, it can stifle critical thinking and creativity. Progressive educators work to share power through open-ended questions, student-led discussions, and collaborative knowledge construction. Interruptions, higher status speakers interrupt more frequently and are interrupted less often, controlling conversational flow. Question forms, powerful speakers use declarative statements. Less powerful speakers frame statements as questions seeking validation. Topic control, those who with power introduce and shift topics others follow or struggle to redirect conversation, turn talking dominant speakers um, take longer turns, overlap others' speech, and determine when conversations end. Cross-cultural encounters and gatekeeping, when participants come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, power dynamics intensify occurs when institutional representatives, immigration officers, job interviews, university admissions staff control access to resources through language-based assessments, non-native speaker or those using non-standard varieties face barriers even when substantively qualified. Accent discrimination, different conversation norms, and cultural assumptions about directness or difference create systematic disadvantages. Activity prompts. Analyze a brief dialogue, review a transcript of a conversation, teacher, student, customer service, job interview, and identify specific linguistic features that signal power relations. Look for who asks questions, who provides information, whose topics are pursued, who interrupts, how do participants address each other, what does this reveal about institutional power, language and social control and resistance. Language maintains social order. Language can manipulate and control populations in ways that appear natural or inevitable. Through discourse, dominant groups legitimize their authority, make hierarchies seem necessary, and limit what can be thought or said. This control operates not through obvious coercion, but through the subtle shaping of reality itself. Hidden power in polite language. Consider seemingly polite requests in workplace settings. Could you possibly finish that report by Friday? Appears to offer choice, but the power relationships makes refusal practically impossible. This indirect language obscures the actual directive, making power relations less visible and thus harder to challenge. Similarly, in institutional talks, the formal language of court, hospitals, schools, and bureaucracies uses specialized terminology and produce procedures that mystify processes and exclude ordinary people from full participation. Hidden power in polite language. Consider seemingly polite requests in workplace settings. Could you possibly finish that report by Friday? Appears to offer choice, but the power relationship makes refusal practically impossible. This indirect language obscures the actual directive, making power relations less visible and thus harder to challenge. Similarly, institutions talk The formal language of courts, hospitals, schools, and bureaucracies uses specialized terminology and procedures that mystify processes and exclude ordinary people from full participation. Euphemisms and double speak. Collateral or collateral damage instead of civilization death, right? Sizing instead of layoffs, enhanced integration instead of torture, language that obscures unpleasant realities and shields powerful actors from accountability, normalization, turning actions into abstract nouns removes human agents. There was a decision to restructure, hides who decided and why, making institutional actions appear as natural processes beyond anyone's control. Authority through registration. Legal, medical, and academic language creates barriers that position experts as necessary interpreters, maintaining professional power and excluding lay participation in decisions affecting their lives. Resistance through discourse. However, language is not only a tool of domination, it is equally a means of resistance. Marginalized communities challenge dominant narratives by creating alternative discourses that reframe expressions, assert identities, and mobilize collective action. Social movements demonstrate the liberatory potential of language. Example, the civil rights movement strategically reframed racial discrimination from a southern problem to national moral crisis through powerful rhetoric. Martin Luther King's Jr. I Have a Dream speech created a counter discourse of equality and justice that challenged prevailing racist ideologies. The movement's language set ends freedom, rights, we can, shall overcome, and they made it a song, We Shall Overcome, constructed new social meanings and possibilities. Contemporary movements like Me Too and the Black Lives Matter similarly use discourse to challenge power structures. Hashtag activism creates spaces for marginalized voices to share experiences, build solidarity, and demand accountability by controlling their own narratives rather than being defined by others. These movements shift the power relations and force institutional changes. Language becomes a set of struggle where subordinate groups assert agency and resist dominant definitions of reality. Discourse and identity construction, gender identity, gendered language patterns, differences in politeness, assertiveness, emotional experience are learned through socializing and perform gender in interaction. Discourse constructs the what masculine and feminine mean in specific contexts, maintaining but also challenging gender norms, ethnic and racial identity. Ethnic identities emerge through language choices, including code switching, accent, vocabulary, and narrative styles that affiliates speakers with particular communities. Dominant discourses rap, racialize groups through stereotypical representations that naturalize inequality. Cultural identity, cultural membership is performed through discourse praxis, storytelling traditions, humor, styles, terms of address, and communication norms. What counts as appropriate, respectful, or meaningful varies across cultures and must be learned and enacted through language. Ideology embedded in language. Language choices carry ideological weight, reflecting and reinforcing systems of belief about how society should be organized. Consider the phrase working mother, why not working father? This asymmetry reveals ideological assumption that motherhood and women's primary in identity, while fatherhood is secondary to professional identity. Such patterns, repeated across countless interactions, naturalize gendered divisions of labor. Dominant discourses promote varieties as superior to dialects or non-native varieties, creating hierarchies that have profound political implications. Standard English, for example, is not linguistically superior but socially privileged because it is associated with educated, wealthy, white speakers. Insisting on standard language in institutional contexts, schools, courts, workplaces, disadvantages speakers of other varieties, perpetuating social inequality through seemingly neutral language policies. Reflection question: how does your language use reflect or resist the power? Think about code switching you might do between contexts, home, school, social media. What identities do you perform in different settings? When do you accommodate to dominant language norms? And when you do, you assert alternative ways of speaking. What power relations are at play in these choices? By recognizing how discourse constructs identity, we gain agency to resist imposed identities and construct more empowering self representation. We can challenge stereotypes, reclaim stigmatized language varieties, and create spaces for marginalized identities to flourish. Media discourse and the power. Mass media represent one of the most powerful discourse institutions in contemporary society, shaping public opinions, setting political agendas, and constructing a collective understanding of reality. News media, in particular, claim objectivity while inevitably making choices about what to cover, how to frame stories, whom to quote, and which perspectives to privilege. These choices systematically advantage certain groups while marginalize others. Selection and framing. Media power begins with gatekeeping decisions about what becomes new and what remains invisible. Events involving powerful people receive this proportionate coverage, while issues affecting marginalized communities are underreported. When covered, the framing, the interpretive angle that gives events meaning reflects dominant perspective, favoring elite sources. Journalists rely heavily on official sources, governments, official corporate spokespersons, expert institutions, granting them legitimacy and prominence. Ordinary citizens, activists, or community members appear less frequently, and their perspectives carry less authority. This practice reproduces power hierarchies by amplifying elite voices while treating alternative viewpoints as marginal or biased. Visual representation. Imagine a company news stories carry powerful ideology messages. Photos of protesters might emphasize confrontation and disorder, while images of policy emphasize professionalism and control. Marginalized groups are often depicted through stereotypical imagery that reinforces negative associations. Linguistic strategies that obscure power. Normalization. The decision was made to close the factory 3, turning actions into nouns, remove human agents from view. Who decided why these crucial questions disappear, making institutional actions seem like inevitable occurrences rather than choices. Passive voice mistakes were made. 3 passive constructions hide responsibility. Active voice would reveal who made mistakes and create accountability, but passive voice protects powerful actors from scrutiny. Euphemism. The company is streaming options. 3 pleasant sounding phrases mask unpleasant realities. Streamlining sounds efficient and positive, obscuring the job losses and the human causes of corporate decisions. Example, analyzing a news headline for ideological bias. Consider 2 headlines describing the same event. Police restore order after violent protests turn chaotic. Police crack down on peaceful demonstrators exercising free speech. The first headline frames protesters as threats requiring controls using words like violent and chaotic, while portraying police as restoring order. The second frame protesters as exercising rights and police as suppressing a legitimate expression. Both describe the same event by constructing opposite realities through lexical choices, focus, and framing. Neither is truly objective. Each reflects particular ideological positions about authority, protest, and social order. Developing critical media literacy requires constantly asking whose perspective is centered, who's absent, what is taken for granted, what alternative framing are possible. By recognizing these patterns, we become more sophisticated media consumers who can identify and resist resist ideological manipulation. Classroom discourse and the power relations. The classroom is a mechanism of broader social power relations, where discourse practices shape not only what is learned, but how students understand their roles, capabilities, and relationships to knowledge. Discussion, often celebrated as democratic and empowering, actually involves complex negotiations of power that teachers must navigate thoughtfully. Discussion as both tools and exercise of power. Classroom discussion can be pedagogically powerful, promoting critical thinking, collaborative learning, and student voice. However, discussions simultaneously exercise power through implicit and explicit rules about participation, evaluation, and legitimate knowledge. Teachers hold institutional authority to intimate discussions, evaluate contributions, redirect conversations, and determine whose ideas merit development, even in ostensible centered discussions. Teacher power remains present. Teacher authenticity. Teachers must establish enough authority to create productive learning environments while avoiding dominance that silence students. Student empowerment. Effective discussions cultivate student agency, allowing learners to shape conversations, challenge ideas, and construct knowledge collaboratively. Finding balance, the goal is balancing structure with freedom, guidance with autonomy, so students develop as independent critical thinkers. Ground rules for democratic discussions, establishing explicit ground rules helps mitigate power imbalances and create inclusive discussion environments. These might include everyone's voice matters, ensure equitable speaking opportunities, listen actively and respectfully to different perspectives, challenge ideas, not people, focus on arguments, not individuals, make space for silence and reflection, not just quick responses, acknowledge your own positionality and potential biases. Build on others' ideas rather than dominating airtime. Recognize that discomfort can be productive for learning. Value diverse ways of knowing and expressing ideas. Strategies to mitigate power imbalances. Think Pasha. Allow individual reflection, then pair discussion before whole class sharing. This scaffolding supports less confident speakers. Structured turn taken use techniques like pass a talking stick or calling on non-volunteers to ensure dominant voices do not monopolize discussions. Written contributions incorporate online discussions boards or written responses to so students with different communication styles can participate meaningfully. Small group work break into smaller groups where quiet students may feel more comfortable speaking than synthesize insights as a whole class. By attending carefully to classroom discourse and power relations, educators create more equitable learning environments where all students can develop as critical thinkers and active participants in knowledge construction. The goal is to eliminating power, which is impossible, but exercising it ethically and thoughtfully in service of student empowerment. The role of the discussion leader, powerful and responsibility. Leading discussions requires navigating ethical tensions inherent in the facilitator role. Discussion leaders exercise significant power. They select the topics, frame questions, and manage participation, evaluate contributions, and ultimately shape the learning experience. This power brings essential responsibility to foster democratic participation while maintaining productive learning environments. Hmm. Ethical considerations in exercising power. Stephen D. Brookfield, in his influential work on discussion as a teaching method, emphasizes that discussion leads must constantly reflect on how their power affects participants. Key ethical questions include: how do my questions direct or constrain possible responses? Am I privileging certain types of knowledge or ways of knowledging or knowing? Whose voices am I amplifying, and whose am I inadvertently silencing? How does my social identity, race, gender, class affect the power dynamics? Am I creating psychological safety for risk taking and disagreements? Techniques to foster participation and critical thinking: ask open-ended questions. Avoid questions with predetermined correct answers. Use how and why questions that invite multiple perspectives and genuine exploration rather than testing students' ability to guess what you're thinking. Embrace productive silence. Wait time matters. Allow 10 to 15 seconds after posing questions for students to think. Resist to urge to fill silence and it creates a space for deeper inflection and reflection and encourages thoughtful rather than reactive responses. Uh, on student ideas rather than evaluating each comment as correct or incorrect. Connect the students' contributions to each other. Ask follow-up questions like, how does that relate to what Sarah said earlier, to foster dialogue rather than parallel monologues. Avoiding domination and encouraging diverse voices. Discussion leaders must actively work against patterns where dominant voices, whether the leaders own or certain students, monopolize discussions. This requires deliberate strategies, monitor participation patterns, keep mental or written track or who speaks and how often actively invite contributions from Twitter participants. Jameh, what's your perspective on, or Jimmy, what's your perspective on this? Interrupt appropriately when dominant speakers take excessive time, politely interrupt to create space for others. That's a great point. Mark, let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet. Validate diverse contributions, explicitly value different types of contributions, personal experiences, questions, connections, challenges, not just assertive arguments or right answers. The discussion leaders' challenge is to exercise authority without um, authoritarianism, to create structure without stifling spontaneity, and to maintain direction without dominating. Stephen D. Brockfield. Effective discussion leadership means constantly reflecting on one's use of power, remaining power to feedback about how facilitator choices affect the participation, and committing to democratic ideals even when challenging or uncomfortable. The goal is cultivating environments where all participants develop critical thinking capacities and find their voices. Cross-cultural power in discourse, when discourse participants some come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, power dynamics become especially complex and consequential. Communication differences rooted in cultural norms can create misunderstanding, reinforce stereotypes, and systematically disadvantage those from non-dominant cultures. Understanding these cross-cultural power dynamics is essential for creating more equitable and inclusive communication spaces. Challenges in cross-cultural communication, different communication norms. Cultures vary dramatically in communication styles, direct versus indirect, individual versus collective orientation, high context versus low context, what counts as polite, assertive, or appropriate differs across cultures. Mismatches can lead to negative judgments when behaviors are interpreted through one's own cultural frameworks or framework rather than recognized as cultural differences. Language proficiency barriers. Non-native speakers face disadvantages even when highly competent. They may process language more slowly, struggle with idioms, or use grammatical structure that mark them as outsiders. These linguistic differences often lead to unfair assessments of intelligence, competence, or credibility. gatekeeping and exclusion in institutional settings. Gatekeeping refers to processes by which institutional representatives control access to resources, opportunities, and services through language-based assessment, immigration, interviews, job applications, university admissions, healthcare consultation, and legal proceedings all involve gatekeeping where cultural and linguistic differences become barriers. Job interviews, candidates from cultures evaluating humanity may understand um, accomplishment disadvantaging them in cultures expecting self-promotion. Indirect communication styles may be misread as evasiveness or lack of confidence. Healthcare encounters patients with limited language proficiency receive less information, ask fewer questions, and experience whose health outcomes. Cultures or cultural differences in discussion, symptoms, or family involvement create additional barriers. Legal settings, non-native speakers face advantages or disadvantages in courts where linguistic performance is assessed for credibility. Cultural differences in eye contact, narrative structure, or emotional expression can be misinterpreted as dishonesty. Educational contexts, students from cultures emphasizing listening and observation may be judged negatively in classrooms, valuing active participation and debate. Different rhetorical traditions affect how arguments are structured and evaluated. Strategies for inclusive cross-cultural communication. Creating a more equitable cross-cultural discourse requires intentional efforts from individuals, especially those from dominant cultural groups. Develop cultural humanity, recognize that your communication norms are not universal, approach differences with curiosity rather than judgment, ask questions to understand rather than assuming deficit or incompetence, slow down and check understanding. Use clear, simple language without being condensing, pause frequently to invite questions, summarize key points, and confirm shared understanding rather than assuming comprehension. Value diverse communication styles, recognize that directness is not inherently better than indirectness, no, vice versa. Create a space for multiple ways of participating, written and oral, individual and collaborative, um, immediate and reflective. Address power asymmetries, acknowledge when you hold institutional power and work to mitigate its effects. Provide multiple channels for feedback. Use interpreters when appropriate. Make explicit what might be culturally implicit. Case example: workplace communication across cultures. In a multinational company, a manager from direct communication culture gives free back to and everyone or to employee from an indirect culture. The manager says this report needs significant improvement before we can use it. The employee, interpreting this through indirect cultural norms, understands this as devastating criticism and feels deeply ashamed. The manager, meanwhile, intended constructive feedback and expected the employee to ask clarifying questions about what to improve. Neither is wrong. They're operating from different cultural frameworks. Effective cross-cultural competence requires recognizing these differences and adjusting communication to build shared understanding rather than assuming one's own norms are universal. Finally, applying this course and the power analysis, practical exercise. Now it's time to apply the concepts you've learned through hands-on analysis. This practical exercise will help you develop critical awareness of how power operates through language in real contexts. By analyzing actual texts or transcripts, you'll sharpen your ability to grasp scores, patterns, and their social implications. We will continue, inshallah, next time, starting from exercise instructions. So thank you so much for watching me teaching you something important about discourse and power. Until next time, ta for now.